We are live. Right, fantastic. So, hello and welcome to the launch of the Climate Risk Forum. My name is Simon Osborne. I am the CEO of IFI Global, which many of you probably won't know is a research and media house based in the City of London. We have 3 monthly publications and 1 weekly. And unusually for us, in a very good way, climate risk actually covers subject matter covered in 2 of those monthly publications, which are Sustainable Investment Intelligence, SII, and the NED, which is our fund governance publication. Today, I am joined with David Hawkins, who is ESG climate and regulatory lead at the Next Energy Group, and by Max Hilton, who is managing director of Apex Risk Technologies and who is based in Barcelona, and Karina Vaughan, who is CSO and head of ESG and climate risk at Fathom. And I would like to thank Fathom very much indeed for sponsoring this event and the support they've given us and the chats we've had with them over the months, if not years now, on the subject of climate risk. It's been very, very much appreciated. So today, what we are going to do is I'm going to give, because this is the very first Climate Risk Forum, I'm going to give a brief introduction as to why we are doing this thing. And then I'm going to ask the panel here to define climate risk. And then we're going to get into a panel discussion on the issues that need to be addressed. And finally, we are going to save probably at least 15 minutes for questions. We already have some of those because I know, unfortunately, there's quite a lot of people who aren't able to join us live, but wanted to, and some of those have submitted questions today. And so I've included those, and we'll get to those towards the end of the session. So let me say to you to start with, welcome yet again to the very first Climate Risk Forum. And this really is the start of something substantial that we are doing in terms of our climate risk coverage. There will be a monthly section on climate risk in each issue of our publication, Sustainable Investment Intelligence. And this forum will be quarterly as well. But on top of that, we are about to undertake a major research study with institutional investors on climate risk matters, starting very soon and going on probably for pretty much the rest of the year. And I'll mention a bit more about that in a second. The reason in particular for our expansion into climate risk comes after a research study we did with Fathom, the flood risk specialists last autumn. It showed that very few people in the investment business that we contacted, and we contacted a lot of them, and indeed not just in investment management, we contacted people in banking and insurance as well. But particularly what I'm saying applies to investment management. Very few of the people that we were surveying at that time for this research focused on anything to do with climate that was outside their area. They focused on the particular specific interest that they had in their particular area, but they tended to, if it's not putting it too strongly, ignore the rest. We believe it is, or it would be, of real benefit for the industry, and especially to those serving on boards, if it took a more holistic approach to climate risk. The hope of the Climate Risk Forum is that it will help them do that. And by comparison with other areas of risk management, and we as a business do look into several others in the investment industry, one can say, I think, pretty much for certain that climate risk is by far the newest, and it is evolving all the time as our understanding of it grows. And there is, on top of that, there is a much more limited data set in comparison with other risk areas, For example, one can trace market risk all the way back, I guess, as far as the South Sea bubble, if not before. But more important than all of that is that climate risk is extraordinarily multi-dimensional in a way that no other form of risk is. It covers environmental risk, it covers regulatory risk, litigation risk, reputational risk, business risk, both physical risk and also transition risk, and of course, and not least, it includes investment risk too. So the Climate Risk Forum will be covering all of that, as will the coverage in our new section starting next month in SII. And before getting into the panel, I just wanted to spend a second telling you about the research we will be doing with investors on climate risk. We will be researching institutional investors around the world to better understand how they manage and analyze climate risk, what they focus on, and how they focus on it, as well as what they may not be factoring in at the moment. We plan to do the research in 3 parts. In North America, that will almost certainly be the first one, starting extremely soon. Europe, and also the Asia Pacific region. And we hope to be working with an organization that we've worked with before and we know very well, which advises pension funds and sovereign wealth funds and other institutional investors on in all these parts of the world on a variety of things, including in the climate and ESG and sustainable areas. The aim is to get the first part of this study done by the time we hold the second Climate Risk Forum, which we hope probably will be in July, and then the second part before the one in the autumn, etc., etc. And I see that Autech Finance, just is just something we've seen very recently, has just published a research report stating that physical climate risk is the most long-term threat that institutional investors now face. Apparently, I think they also said in the report, which we all know anyway, doubtless, that there is not going to be net zero by 2050. And I would have thought even the youngest person, either seeing this video today or sometime in the future, even the far future, even the youngest one is going to be working in an environment where the climate is going to almost certainly be getting worse during that individual's working life. So this is the world we unfortunately live in. Sorry to be giving a rather depressing introduction, but hopefully, as we now turn to the panel, they can cheer us up a bit on that. So. As I said at the beginning, we're going to ask each of the panel members to do their definition of climate risk. I didn't ask them who wants to go first. Does anyone want to put their hand up and say they're going to go first? Or David, I'm seeing you on the screen. Perhaps we can come to you unless somebody else wants to jump in. And please give us your definition.
Yeah, of course. So I think climate risk can come in a variety of forms. I think probably for most of the viewers here, the best thing to think about is how it creates financial risk to the companies and the investments in which we look at. The conventional way to look at climate risk is in kind of 2 sort of buckets. You've got climate physical risk and climate transition risk. Physical risk being exactly what you would imagine. So heavy snowfall, heavy rain, drought, extreme heat, erosion of soil, erosion of foundations, coastal flooding, any type of flooding really. And those risks can be separated into acute and chronic. And depending on your assets will affect your assets differently. A real estate asset may have trouble accessing water. a solar asset may have increased cloud cover and will reduce its irradiation and output. There's a lot there to think about, and it depends on your asset class, what's going to be, and the region in which you operate as to what's going to be relevant. Transitional risk is the other bucket, and that is equally powerful, I would say. Both of these buckets have the potential to be materially concerning financially. Transition risk is effectively any regulatory policy, technologically, changing, stakeholder reputational interests that can affect your or erode your returns and put your assets at risk. An example could be an oil and gas company where the world is moving towards a net zero future. Obviously, at some point, oil and gas, we're already seeing it, and fossil fuels, for example, with coal being phased out across the world gradually. If you're invested in something like that, then over time, if you don't seek to modernize, then you could be left with stranded assets. Conversely, renewables, for example, which is what we specialize in, if, for example, the UK decides to push back the grid infrastructure replacements or upgrades, our assets may not be switched on at the right times, and therefore we have a loss of earnings. Or if, for example, a government pushes back a commitment to renewable cars, the electricity demand will obviously not be as high as you would expect. And finally, on transition things, transition risk, there's huge amounts to cover, but carbon taxes, social cost of carbon, your reputation and social license to operate are all concerns as well. So, not just carbon emissions trading schemes in your region, so the EU, the UK, I believe China and a number of other countries around the world, but also cross-border. So if you're importing, if you're importing into the EU, you will likely be covered by the CBAM, or the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which will apply to certain types of industries carbon tax. And the UK is also looking to create its own CBAM as well. So there's lots of concerns there that can lead to financial considerations. Of course, there are opportunities, but I won't go into that. I'll give the floor away.
Karina, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you, Simon. So, I think the interesting thing about climate risk is that it covers a lot of ground. So at its very core, it's about how climate change can affect and is affecting the value, the performance and the resilience of investments. So whether that's through extreme weather events or through the transition to a low or lower carbon economy. And it can show up in investment portfolios in a number of ways, and it's not always immediately obvious. So as David said, at a very basic level, there is physical risk, the physical side of climate risk. So you could be invested in assets or properties that are located in areas with growing flood or growing wildfire risk. And if those risks are not priced in, or if insurance becomes unavailable for the assets, then the value of those assets can fall very quickly. As David also said, there's transition risk. So industries or companies can be vulnerable to different regulatory changes, new disclosure rules, carbon pricing, or they may lose competitiveness as the economy decarbonizes. So we might see capital flight from businesses that don't have credible transition plans. And I think what makes climate risk much more complex than any other risk is the number of other risks that it actually touches. And this is something that came out very strongly in the research that you did for us. So, climate risk encompasses regulation, reputation, legal risk, operational risk. It is so multidimensional, so complex, so interconnected. And and in particular, interconnected with financial risk. So at Fathom, our focus is on the physical side of the equation. So we use geospatial data, we use scientific models to show right the way down to a building level how exposed an asset or a portfolio is to future flooding. And so we turn the abstract into something tangible and decision-worthy that decision makers that are dealing with climate risk can use.
Thank you. And Max, may I come to you as well?
Of course, Simon, thank you. And I think in the right order too, having David speak to, investee companies and the physical and transitional risk, and Karina speaking to how some of those risks are priced and the processes one can use to consider that. Our perspective at Apex Risk Technologies is a level removed from a portfolio perspective. So, considering an investment fund and portfolio, and for us probably, narrower in that sense of considering climate risk, a potential misalignment of principles that a fund has set out that it wants to embrace with a framework as to how it's going to actually measure or demonstrate that. And for us, that might be with respect to PAI's, principal adverse indicators, or sustainable development goals, the UN sustainable development goals, of which climate action is one. And so our purpose, we act as a data partner in a sense to our Manco clients and fund manager clients, is to make sure that they're both from a data perspective and a model perspective, there's some rigor and challenge and a partner. That's the main concern for us within our business on climate risk. Perhaps second order, as I think the other panelists touched on, perhaps misalignment with the existing investment processes. So how will the data fit into the standard risk return objectives? We see some clients, for us, we're much more concerned on the first order, which is risk management, but from a portfolio management perspective, will a client consider that it has a certain budget to, say, carbon emissions, and it will look to feed that into, say, some sort of optimization process, as it would with limits on a particular asset class, for example, or country allocation. And understanding better, and Karina said, the interconnectivity of climate risk with other factors. I think a lot of academic research has shown that companies that embrace ESG tend to perform better, but the causality, that could be that they're better performing companies that have better resources to manage their data and put practices into effect. So I think there's probably some misunderstandings on causality and the need to better use and present data from an internal governance perspective as well. For us, a lot of it's presenting externally to regulators too. So that's my perspective.
Okay, thank you. Well, then let's get on with the three different but more by luck than design, somewhat complementary definitions of what climate risk is, and to showing your different areas of expertise at the same time. So thank you for that. So my first real question is, what are the different ways that climate risk impacts investment funds? Gosh, who to go to first on that? Perhaps, Max, we should reverse the order and go to you, because you see in your job a wide variety of different forms of funds in different categories all the time. How would you answer that question?
So repeat that again, Simon.
What are the different ways that climate risk impacts investment funds?
I think, specifically for those funds that have climate objectives, I mean, front and center. And the concerns there are twofold, I think. One, the data that's being used to facilitate that assessment, and then also the model. And the challenges from a stakeholder perspective, whether it's an institutional investor looking to invest, or the concerns of a non-exec director is around the transparency and understanding of seeing these principles actually manifest. So to show the portfolio climate impact, for example, I mean, it's easy with, say, PAIs. You can look at the percentage of companies that don't have specific emission reduction targets, but looking through individual companies and to a portfolio level on actual emissions data, applying this to a model, understanding the defaults that are being used where that data doesn't exist, knowing the sensitivity to some assumptions there. I think that is a major concern. And you mentioned, Simon, the changing political environment that we see in the US, of course, most extreme, but in other parts of the world, the cost or impact for attesting, for stating to have climate objectives and not being able to back it up are being demonstrated with some pretty big fines, and regulators adopting a really tough tone in the last couple of months, Australia and New Zealand specifically.
And across one of the things our research, and perhaps I can come to you, Karina, showed was how advanced the Asia Pacific region is in that whole area too, probably more so in many respects than any other part of the world. But also to the main question, what are the different ways that climate risk impacts investment funds, do you think, from your perspective? And as Fathom, you're doing, I understand, more and more work in the investment fund management area. I think originally more from the insurance sector and moving into this part of a new part of developing part of your business.
Yeah, I mean, Fathom's business was built initially on business from the insurance and reinsurance industry. Now our business is pretty much evenly spread across insurance, capital markets, and engineering and public sector. And interestingly, most of our business comes from the US. So, when you ask about the impact of climate risk on investment funds, of course, if we look at it through a Fathom lens, it's very much focused on the physical risk, the risk to assets of flooding, both from the perspective of investment and of course credit. And we see that manifesting itself in a number of ways, and probably the most predominant way, as Max has quite rightly pointed out, is this demand, this need for transparency in how investment funds analyze and manage and report on climate risk. And I think we've made a lot of progress in this area. But if we're being really honest, transparency is still one of the biggest blind spots in climate risk analysis. And too often we see the data, the methodology behind, and I hate this term, a risk score or a climate assessment is simply not visible. So we don't know what model was used. We don't know what assumptions have been made. Very often we don't know what emissions pathway or time horizon the assumptions have been based on, or sometimes even whether it reflects physical transition or both types of risk. And so that's a real problem. If you're sitting on a board, or you're allocating capital and you can't interrogate the basis of a risk assessment, then you're operating blind. You can't compare outputs, you can't challenge them, and it undermines trust and ultimately governance. And so I think, this desire, this need for transparency is driving a demand for greater disclosure in terms of modeling methods and inputs. And in particular, what are the limitations of the model? We're looking for more standardized expectations from regulators, because right now we're not comparing apples with apples between jurisdictions. And I think, the drive for transparency also moving slowly towards better communication across functions, from the modelers of the risk, the data providers, the portfolio managers, and the board committees themselves. And so again, transparency driving a need to bridge the gap between technical analysis of the data and the decision making that's being made on the basis of that data.
Thank you. And something, I see a question's come in from a member of the audience, and I was going to say, I forgot to mention this in my introduction, but I'll say this to everyone now. Please don't wait till the end. If you want to ask questions, please just send in questions as we go along. But as I say, we will also save some time to try and tackle questions we've already got, and potentially more we're going to get now at the end. But don't wait until the end. Send them in now if you'd like to do that. David, coming to you, can you also answer, if you don't mind, the different ways that you think climate risk impacts investment funds? But to keep this thing moving forward, I'm also going to throw in the next question is, do you think that the boards in the financial industry have a full and comprehensive grasp of all the issues that climate risk is associated with? This came up a bit in our prep call. I remember you mentioning that. If the answer to that question is no, which you might well be saying, unless you've changed your mind a bit since we spoke the other day, what do you think, why do you think that they have such trouble? Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot's been said on the first part of the question. And it's always going to depend in terms of what, how the risk affects your fund and what the fund is focusing on. I would say, I would just add to that and say, uncertainty in many ways, including regulatory uncertainty, is a killer. It only takes one individual, as we've seen, to come in and dramatically change the status quo and add huge amounts of uncertainty. And people may immediately jump to who I'm talking about, but equally, the EU omnibus is borderline deregulation. It's debatable, and whether it's going in the right direction. And that is going to put funds at a disadvantage in understanding the risk, because as Karina and Max have touched on, the information out there, and the standards and the approaches they're getting better, but they're still varying. So I think that there's an element there, which I would class as transitional risk, where you're seeing changes in regulation and policies, and that can, be cause for concern, and obviously, it could even create exposure to, legal considerations in the US, for example, depending on the laws and approach taken there. To answer your question on, do I think the boards in the financial industry have a full and comprehensive knowledge? I think, like, there's a question in the audience as well, which is very similar, or is very much related about, are we going to see a demand for climate and sustainable experts on the board? So I'll try and cover that too. The answer is it's mixed. Some boards are very well informed, a lot are not, and I would say that the TCFD and the ISSB out there is designed to try to standardize the climate risk approach, and the climate assessment and portraying of those risks. And there's a number of frameworks out there, TCFD and ISSB being the main ones. However,
can I sort of interrupt you? What does the ISSB stand for?
International Sustainability Standards Board. It's governed by it's a part of the IFRS, and they have taken on stewardship of the TCFD.
Okay.
So they are now, effectively it's an iteration of the TCFD requirements, and that's going to be expected to be mandated in the UK by the FCA at some point. For asset managers under over 5 billion, I believe, with the AUM. There's a mix of knowledge out there, and the TCFD and ISSB are going some way to try to add clarity in that. But what we've seen from our experience is that TCFD and ISSB reports aren't always at the level they should be, and we've had investors coming to us saying, look, these reports are just too corporatized. They are not painting a risk of what you're doing on the ground. So they're, we don't know, as Karina touched on, what models, or even if you are telling us the scenarios you're applying, how are you determining whether whether you have, whether it's going to impact your asset materially, and it's very difficult to do that. And the TCFD and the ISSB are pushing towards something called CVAR, which is climate value at risk, and that's effectively turning all of your risk into a financial number. But there's a lot of uncertainty around that, and you'll find a lot of fund managers and a lot of funds, rightly or wrongly, are very afraid of that because it can introduce uncertainty and potentially risk valuing their assets negative, or reducing the impact of reducing the value of their assets. And what you found really is that I haven't seen many first movers there, and you see a lot of challenge. And for me, all of this is kind of leading to an overview of climate risk, which is maybe not as advanced as it could be. It's certainly improving, but it's not as advanced as it could be. And to answer the question in the audience, are we going to see, climate experts on the boards? Potentially, yes. I mean, potentially we're already seeing that at the heads of ESG, for a lot of the big players. And, because it's very difficult to standardize this, you may well be well placed to do that. Because if the standard of the disclosures out there is not comparable and is not standardized and is not useful, then in many ways, could you be misinterpreting the risk? Could somebody be misstating the risk, whether intentional or unintentionally? So I think, there's a lot left to learn in it, and it comes with the standardization of the approaches and the transparency, as we've already touched on. So hopefully I've answered that. But again, it's a very, very nuanced, it's a very complex subject at the end of the day.
It is a very complex subject, yeah. One of the things we've gone into in the past, and maybe bring the others in, I don't know if this is an area that either Karina or Max, you guys get involved in, but climate VAR, and whether or not climate VAR is going to be the sort of standard in the way that VAR is the standard outside the climate, because I understand there's a lot of criticism of climate VAR because it's it's not necessarily reliable data that's going in there. Anyway, is that something you guys get involved in at all? Claris Apex risk. Do you ever get involved in climate VAR and things like that, Max? Is that something you deliver to board meetings or something?
No, I certainly don't hear boards, those in a governance role, asking for a climate VAR. And as David said, we haven't come across any fund manager clients looking to be a first mover in that regard. Look through the technical documentation that other vendors put out who are calculating climate VAR. I think a gap that we see and that we've been looking to address is coverage of instruments across the capital structure. So the inclusion, say, derivatives, being able to net across different securities for an issuer, and even considering long-short exposures. That's an area that we see as there tends to be a deficiency, let's say, in the market. And because we work with a lot of hedge funds, not necessarily Article 8 or Article 9, but they have an interest in having these metrics to hand. So I think that's an area of value add. We see interest in for those firms, that do have Article 8 or Article 9 funds, committees supporting the board and producing reports. And I think, like any other area of risk management, to say that it's effective, you need to be able to point to examples of change, challenge and change. Cases where definitions are ambiguous, or there are issues with assumptions or issues with data, that it should be an iterative process. So we see boards having a lot of concern as to their exposure on this, and perhaps the lack of challenge, or the lack of, they just want to be able to point to some activity and a function that's actually operating. I don't know, maybe pass to Karina.
Yeah, I was going to say, Karina, with that, with in addition to what's being covered, how is Fathom data used by boards, if it's used by boards and by managers, in terms of what we're talking about, statistical input?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe just to take a little step back from that in terms of the board's grasp of climate risk. So I think boards are certainly more climate aware than they were a few years ago. But one of the most significant challenges, aside from the fact that climate risk feels it feels very technical, it feels very fast moving, is the science that's used to measure and understand climate risk. I mean, for the most, physical climate risk is measured using geospatial data. Now, geospatial data is excellent in that it provides both spatial and temporal insights into risk. But the challenge is that you have many, many, many different data sets that have to be considered. I mean, if you think about the, measuring physical climate risk to an asset, you need data, depending on where the asset is, on wildfire, inland flooding, coastal flooding, subsidence, earthquake, hail. Now we've got biodiversity data coming in as well. So you've got this vast volume of different geospatial data sets, which has to be ingested into the risk system, cleaned and standardized, and then analyzed in a way that provides data that is actionable and can be used for informed decision making. And of course, finding geospatial data skills in the market where they're in very high demand is difficult for large institutions, but it's even more difficult for for smaller funds and for smaller companies. And so the ability of the organization to provide that data to boards, and for boards to to really understand and dig below the surface of the data is a real skills challenge.
And this perhaps comes to arguably the most important question, perhaps certainly the bluntest question you're going to get this afternoon, is: do you think that institutional investors, by and large, there are exceptions and so on, but by and large, do you think that institutional investors have a good grasp of climate risk issues? And if the answer is no, what do they need in practical, realistic, rather than aspirational, waffly, practical, realistic ways to get there? And I'll add a rider to that because it came up in the prep call. How much does the TCFD help them? Do you want to do that first? And by the way, sorry to say this to all three of you, but it always happens. Time is all galloping on, and we'd love to get to the many, many questions we have. So if you can keep your answers fairly short and to the point, thank you very much.
I'm going to pick up on just the first part of that question. So yes, we see institutional investors becoming more attuned to climate risk. But there are a number of barriers to that: data quality and data usability. So we see institutional investors not looking for vague climate scores or outdated risk maps. They really are looking for decision-ready asset-level data to quantify exposure and to differentiate risk across geographies and sectors. So the answer is yes. We think they do have a good grasp, but they're still facing challenges in getting the right information.
Okay. And David, do you want to have a quick go at that?
I think I agree, absolutely with Karina that the boards have an increasing comprehension of climate risks. I think, does the TCFD give them that? I think if you follow the TCFD to the letter, it should do. I think the TCFD and ISSB are very well intentioned, and I think that if you do follow it, then fine. But I think that we're seeing a lot of surface level coverage with perhaps what, as Karina and Max have touched on, the data set sat behind them not being terribly robust, and therefore TCFD not being as powerful, or a certain TCFD disclosure not being as useful for investor decisions. And that's, for example, in our case, led to investors coming to us and saying, look, we've seen your TCFD, but give us more. What are you doing on the ground? What about your insurances? What about your resilience? You've covered and ticked all the boxes, but we want more. We want more on the ground stuff. And that, to me, means that across the board, they've been kind of unhappy with whatever they're looking at, and they want more information. So I think the TCFD intent is very well intentioned, and I think if you follow it to the letter, you will get there. But I think the data weaknesses behind that are driving maybe it to be not quite enough to portray climate risk.
Max, have you got
Simon,
anything you'd like to?
Yeah, I mean, not hearing directly from institutional investors, more through fund managers, keen for us to assist implementing the SBTi, Science-Based Targets Initiative model, to come up with a Paris-aligned temperature scoring at a fund level. And I think it's important for us to be able to help managers communicate how that temperature score has changed over time and how it can be explained by region or by sector or industry, down to the security level. So I think a word that's been used a lot on the call, transparency, but not just showing at a point in time, but showing like an evolution, and helping communicate this to institutional investors. Now, I can't speak to the demand side of the equation, more just the supplying of information to those institutional investors.
Right. I'm tempted to leave because from our prep call, we have a whole bunch of questions still to go. I'm tempted to leave those and try to go to some of the perhaps more key ones we've got in, or I've got some other ones in addition to the ones we've got here, ridiculously large number. We won't be able to get through them all, but we'll try and answer these questions and in the issue of SII that will be published in mid-June. So David's already kind of done the first one to a large extent anyway. And there's someone's written about a recent study impacting 46% of institutional investors to a significant or to moderate extent. Can investors do more to mitigate physical climate risk within the portfolios? We kind of half touched upon that, but does anyone want to say anything to that? David, it's probably more your area, but others, please do.
Yeah. So look, I mean, it depends. Again, as always, different assets are going to have different exposure to different types of risk. But for us, what we're getting into is one with sort of incoming assets that we're looking to acquire. We carry out enhanced due diligence in comparison with climate mapping. So, for example, if we're going to see wind speed in an area which is according to our climate model, has the asset been stress tested against that wind speed? Have we in the engineering, has that been factored in? And you can apply that to your existing portfolios. For example, agreed that you would have to go through your investee companies, for a lot, depending on how you manage your assets. But ultimately, what you need to understand is the resilience profile of the assets, because that can then lead to your insurability. The things that we are doing, for example, is we are saying, well, look, it's far too costly. We got assets that could be exposed to flood. It's far too costly to go in and change an asset, massive engineering changes. So what low-hanging fruit can we do to engage and enable access to our sites? And then you carry those learnings across to any assets that you may be constructing. And we've got this across the board. So extreme heat, do we need to think about shutdowns? Do we need to think about seasonal variation approaches? So do we need to think about, for our solar panels, increased sort of behaviors on the ground to keep an eye out for wildfires? Do we need to engage with the local fire services? Do we need to clean our panels more often if we're seeing drought and wind speed, which can create fouling? There are a lot there, and it can all be relatively low-hanging fruit, depending on how the assets are managed. Engineering level fixes are very often not cost viable, and that is, these fixes can be applied at the ground level.
Can I jump to a whole area we haven't touched upon at all? Because I'm selecting out 1 or 2 questions that have come in, rather than go over some ground we've already perhaps touched upon. And someone's written about litigation and legal risk within the broader climate risk landscape. Is becoming increasingly talked about, he or she says. Your last, that may be someone who sent that in before, sent it in now. Your last report, meaning I think the one, Karina, they talking about we did together, highlighted directors' duties in considering climate risk. To what extent is this a pressing concern for the investment industry? And have you observed this risk beginning to materialize? It's probably best for you, I would think, Karina. Or Max, actually. Well, no, good for you too.
I'm going to let Max take that one.
All right.
The case, though, was referring to, not at all, Karina. Yeah, Vanguard's ESG fund, the Vanguard Ethically Conscious Bond Index Fund, was recently fined was 13 million Aussie dollars for greenwashing and making misleading claims on exclusion processes. That's one of several similar cases in Australia and New Zealand recently. So I'm speaking on a call in New Zealand next week on this topic, but I think boards that we're working with are highly risk averse, and on Article 8 and Article 9 funds, always top 3 agenda or concern item, how they're able to challenge and evidence an effective risk process around climate risk, or more generally in the sustainability or ESG arena. So I think we're going to have lots of litigation cases, and yeah, irrespective of the political climate, the cases of fines, regulators, investors bringing suits, we'll have plenty of examples.
Okay, I'm going to turn, because we have a bunch of questions from people, as I said earlier, who aren't with us, but will hopefully will be watching the recording of this, or one of the recordings of this. I'm going to club together what 2 or 3 people have asked about. There were 3 questions around the session back to or return to the White House of Donald Trump and what he's done with environmental policy in the States. There's one particular question here from somebody who says, to what extent has the panel seen sustainable investment funding, etc., and focus on climate risk stall in the US as a result of because of what's happened? And what's your view on that, whether there has been any stalling of that? I will add, there have been other questions on whether or not the big US pension funds, we've tracked these, by the way, through our environmental investment monitoring, SII. We haven't seen anything yet ourselves, whether there's been any change of sentiment as a result of what's happening in the US, or whether this is just federal policy in Washington, DC. In other words, to sum it all up, what, if anything, are the changes in terms of what that question asks, but also in terms of institutional allocators, public pension funds, maybe endowments, or even managers? What difference has the change in the political environment in the US made to what's going on in climate risk? Who wants to take that? You said earlier, Karina, that a lot of your business is out of the US.
Yeah. I mean, so obviously we're very focused on physical risk, and our area of specialism is flooding. And flooding is a critical hazard with significant financial and other impact. So yes, we see some I suppose impact from the perspective of public sector. We've seen the term climate risk being taken out of public sector narrative. Fortunately, flood risk is still in there. But with the withdrawal of federal funds to the development of public sector funded projects, we see opportunity for specialist businesses and consulting firms to start to fill that gap within the market. So it's very much an opportunity for us. From the perspective of providing data, so hazard models, catastrophe models, to the capital markets industry. Yes, we see decision making being driven not so much by regulation, but by the need to really understand financial risk to critical assets and to communities. So some impact, but not massive impact.
Okay. And perhaps I should add, on a personal level, of course, as what goes on in Washington doesn't affect everybody. And I partly live on the west coast of Florida, which is still for me the Gulf of Mexico, not the Gulf of America. And last year there were, where we live, 3 hurricanes that came through, and in Sarasota there hadn't been more than one of that, at least of that magnitude, really, in the last 10 years before last year. So, and it's now got to the stage, and this is how serious this matter is, just to bring a real life example, insurance, particularly for flooding, Karina, is so ridiculously expensive. A lot of people, including us, are probably getting to the stage where we're not going to buy insurance because it's so insane. We're just going to, you pay out of your pocket for the damage. It's cheaper to do it that way and quicker than it is to go through an insurance company. Yeah, it is a changing world. So I have a personal interest in this. Changing the subject completely, Max, to your very an area that I think you know a lot about, which is how successful or otherwise has SFDR fund labeling been? Do you think? How has it advanced the sustainable climate risk cause?
I guess it depends on how we want to evaluate its success. Has it been useful for investors? Probably not. And does anyone speak particularly well of it? No one speaks well of it. To me, I think it was well motivated, but problematic in the rollout. And what we've seen, and other participants will have seen, obviously, a form of regulatory arbitrage. Article 9 funds, there are a lot fewer move across to Article 8, and as the behavior from SFDR has been to encourage perhaps more conservative disclosures, and hasn't really promoted or facilitate the type of transparency which I think the panelists on today's calls were looking to have. So it needs to evolve clearly and significantly.
And David, you mentioned you got particular knowledge of the SFDR, I think.
I think, yeah. So we have 4 Article 9 funds, and I came off a call with our lawyers today as we're looking at putting into the EU has invited input into the feelings toward the SFDR, and I think there was recent articles about, Saudi Aramco and other companies being in Article 8 funds, and it's incredibly difficult to really really get a lot from the SFDR these days. I think it was well intentioned, but I'm not really sure it knew what it wanted to be. At first, it was my understanding that the SFDR was never going to be a labeling regime, and then it came through as Article 6, 8, and 9 classifications. And you know what, the PAIs, they do drive performance metrics, and I will say that, which is part of the SFDR. There are some good things with it, but I think there's a lot of improvement to come, and you can't necessarily cross compare it to like the likes of the UK SDR, because it's completely, which is the labeling regime in the UK, which is optional. It's a lot more controlled. For example, that has to come through regulator, whereas SFDR are not really verified. You see some member states applying disciplinary action and legal, and fining companies, but it's hit and miss, and realistically, I think it's an unpoliced landscape, and if you can't base your investment decision solely on SFDR, let's be clear, you have to do a hell of a lot more deep dive, which again leads then to the challenge that we keep mentioning, which is the data quality and data transparency as well.
And there's nothing like it in any other part of the world, and doesn't look like there's going to be anything like it in any other part of the world.
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, yeah, you've got the labeling regime in the UK SDR, and I believe that the ESMA naming rules are going to probably going to sort of shape what SFDR will become. That's assuming that the omnibus doesn't have its or similar efforts like the omnibus don't have their way with it. Ultimately, the SFDR was designed to support the taxonomy so that investors know that they're feeding in funds into investments that are aligned with one of the six objectives. So climate change mitigation, climate change, sort of resilience or biodiversity or whatnot. And I feel that, it's the ambiguity of SFDR and the way people are now aware of it has really weakened that at the minute.
Right, interesting. Okay, well, the hour, as always, this always happens, has gone galloping by. Unfortunately, I know we didn't answer all the questions, including all the questions that we got before the session was even run. But as I said a few minutes ago, we would endeavour to answer those questions, at least in the article that will be published in the June issue of SII. So I'd like to thank everybody who's still with us, who's joined us this afternoon. There will be both a podcast and a recording, a YouTube recording of this webcast as well. And thank you all of those who've submitted questions before and during the session. And thanks very much to Fathom for their support too. And we will be announcing the research, the program, and all the other things we're doing in relation to this in the June issue of SII as well. So thank you all very much, and hopefully see you the next time. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you,
folks. Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.